Okay, guys, good morning. Today we're going to talk about the weather in French. Just for you to be able to make some small talk in French. Also for me to make some small talk in French. We're going to talk about the weather. So, without further ado, let's get in. And we start from the top. So, bonjour, it's time to learn an important small talk staple, how to talk about the weather. As we go through this, you'll get a chance to review some things you've already covered, like adjectives and the verb fair, to make or to do. Let's get to it. What's the weather like? The most basic phrase for asking someone about the weather in French essentially means, what weather is it making? Practice it below together with some common variations. So the first phrase is quel temps fait-il? Quel temps fait-il?
Quel temps fait-il?
Quel temps fait-il? Alors, quel temps fait-il? The other phrase, quel temps fait-il aujourd'hui? Quel temps fait-il aujourd'hui?
Quel temps fait-il aujourd'hui?
Okay. Quel temps fait-il aujourd'hui? The third phrase is quel temps fait-il dehors?
Quel temps fait-il dehors?
Quel temps fait-il dehors? Right, so let's go back from the top. So the first phrase is quel temps fait-il, which means what is the weather like? The second phrase, quel temps fait-il aujourd'hui? What is the weather like today? So this is the English translation. And quel temps fait-il dehors is what is the weather like outside? Once again, quel temps fait-il? What is the weather like? Quel temps fait-il aujourd'hui? What is the weather like today? And quel temps fait-il aujourd'hui is what is the weather like outside? Now, before we move on to talking about how to answer these questions, let's clear up a few vocabulary matters first. All about quel. Quel is Quel. Did you recognize the word quel, which means which or what, at the start of the questions above? You've actually seen it before, as well as its feminine form, quel, which is Quelle. So the masculine form of quel is Quel. The feminine form of quel is Quelle. And to further reiterate, quel means which or what in English. So for example, quel âge as-tu, which is how old are you?
Quel âge as-tu?
Quel âge as-tu? Then we have quelle heure est-il? Quelle heure est-il?
Quelle heure est-il?
Quelle heure est-il, which is what time is it? Quelle heure est-il? And quel is an adjective with the usual four forms. Quel, 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 Quelle, so that's masculine and feminine. Then we have the plural forms, Quels, which is masculine, and we have Quelles, which is feminine, and it means which or what. It's a bit tricky to use, so we're not going to get into exactly how it works just yet. For now, all you need to know is that it uses the form quel, which is what, when it's paired with a masculine singular word like temps, weather, or age, which is age. And it uses the form quel, what, when it is with a feminine singular word like heure, which is hour. We'll save all the details for another time. So you use quel, Quel, when it's paired with a masculine singular word like temps, and you use quel, Quelle, when it's paired with a feminine singular word like heure. Okay, all about temps. As for the word temps, you might have already seen it in a phrase like this one, where it means time. J'ai assez de temps, which means I have enough time.
J'ai assez de temps.
J'ai assez de temps, which means I have enough time. That's because, oddly enough, le temps can mean both the time and the weather. But don't worry, the context usually makes everything clear, so you're unlikely to get the two meanings mixed up. Le temps actually isn't the only French word used to mean the weather. There is also la météo, which people sometimes use to refer to the weather in a more general way. So the phrase is on parle de la météo. On parle de la météo.
On parle de la météo.
On parle de la météo. On parle de la météo. And on parle de la météo means people talk about the weather in English. On parle de la météo means people talk about the weather. La météo is essentially a shortening of la météorologie, the meteorology. And it can be used to mean the meteorology, or it can be used to mean the meteorology, wow, or the weather, or even the forecast. So, because I was eating up my words, la météo is the shortening form of la meteorology. And la meteorology in English means the meteorology, and it could mean the weather and the forecast as well. So la météo could mean la meteorology La météo is the shortening of la meteorologie in French. But la meteorology can be translated to the meteorology in English, or the weather, or the forecast. Voilà. But at the end of the day, le temps, the weather, is more important of the two weather words. It's much more commonly used when people are asking or talking about the weather. So it's the one you will want to mainly memorize, which is la météo. No, sorry, which is le temps. Describing the weather. A few different major sentence structures are used for talking about the weather in French. These are il fait, which means it makes, with an adjective. Il y a, which means there is or there are, with a noun. Le temps est, the weather is, with an adjective, or il, which means it, with a weather verb. Let's go through that again. So we have il fait, it makes, with an adjective. We have il y a, there is or there are, with a noun. We have le temps est, the weather is, with an adjective. And we have il, which means it, with a weather verb. So let's go on to find out how these actually work, right, in practice. So using il fait, which means it makes. When you want to describe what the weather is like using everyday adjectives, for example, nice, cold, hot, etc., the go-to verb in French is faire, and faire in English means to do or to make. That's why it is used to talk about the weather. So, for example, the question is, quel temps fait-il? What's the weather like? And you can see the verb faire being used in this example. It's just because everything in French is assigned a gender, you ask, what is the weather like? Quel temps fait-il? So, for example, the il would be he in a literal translation. So, what weather is it making? Or what weather is he making? I feel like I messed that up, but I mean, we're learning together because I am learning as fast as you are learning, as fast as I'm doing this video actually. So the phrase is quel temps fait-il?
Quel temps fait-il?
Which means what's the weather like? Quel temps fait-il? Here is the main weather describing formula, il fait and the adjective. This is essentially the same as saying it is in English. As you can see, the subject, the thing doing the action, in the French phrase is il, he, which is what I was describing either. So in this sentence, il means it, okay? But il can mean he or it in English. That's because this is an impersonal expression. Just like il est, it is, when you're telling the time. In other words, the action isn't being carried out by a specific person. So you'll never need to use a different subject. It will always be il. Okay, so you never change the gender. It will always be il, okay? And because the subject is always the masculine singular pronoun il, the adjectives that you use will always stay in their masculine singular form. So far, so good. Okay. Let's see what this looks like. Here are some very common ways to describe the weather. Il fait chaud, which means it is hot.
Il fait chaud.
Il fait chaud. Then we have il fait frais.
Il fait frais.
Il fait frais. which means it is cool. Then we have il fait froid, which it definitely is today.
Il fait froid.
Il fait froid. Then we have il fait humide,
Il fait humide.
which means it is humid or damp. Il fait humide. Et voilà. Then we have il fait lourd.
Il fait lourd.
Il fait lourd, which means it is muggy. Il fait lourd. Okay, let's do that again.
Il fait lourd.
Il fait lourd. Il fait lourd. Voilà. Then we have il fait beau, which means it is nice out. The weather is nice.
Il fait beau.
Il fait beau. Then we have il fait mauvais, which means the weather is bad.
Il fait mauvais.
Il fait mauvais. Notice how in the final two examples, you don't include the word temps, weather in French, even though weather is often part of these statements in English. Okay. As you can see from the list above, il fait, it makes, mostly describes feeling and temperature. In fact, you'll use it to talk about specific temperatures too. Il fait 30 degrés, which means it's 30 degrees.
Il fait 30 degrés.
Il fait 30 degrés. Then we have il fait moins 5 degrés. Il fait moins 5 degrés.
Il fait moins 5 degrés.
Il fait moins 5 degrés. Il fait moins 5 degrés, which means it's minus 5 degrees, okay? Keep in mind that in France, as well as in most other French-speaking nations, Celsius is used rather than Fahrenheit. It may be difficult at first to remember to use il fait, it makes, rather than il est, it is, when you're describing weather temperature. But it's important to do so. Et to be is actually only used to talk about temperature when you're describing objects, example, mugs, pans, etc. So, for example, la tasse est chaude.
La tasse est chaude.
Or la tasse est chaude, which means the mug is hot. La tasse est chaude. So at the end of the day, the verb that you use when you're talking about temperature can change what you're saying entirely. Il fait chaud, which means it is hot out.
Il fait chaud.
Il fait chaud. Then we have il a chaud.
Il a chaud.
He is hot. Il a chaud. In this instance, we use the verb avoir. Il a chaud. Il est chaud. It is hot.
Il est chaud.
Il est chaud. Okay, so when you're talking about the weather, you have to use the verb fait. Okay? Like it is making. So it's not, because in English we would say it is hot, but in French you would say it is making when you're describing the weather. If you're talking about a particular object, for example, the one that we used just now was a cup. You say la tasse est chaud, the cup is hot. So you wouldn't use the verb faire when you're talking about a cup. But if you're talking about weather, you use faire. If you're talking about a cup, you use et. And quoi d'autre. And if you're talking about if somebody is hot, like if I have heat, if I am hot, you would use the verb avoir. So 3 different verbs being used. Faire for the weather, avoir for if you're speaking about someone, and for something, you would use et. I hope that's clear. The final example above reflects the standard meaning of a phrase like this. As we mentioned in the lesson on avoir, to have, et, to be, can be used with temperature words to describe people. However, this creates very different meanings. Être froid means to be a cold person. Être chaud means to be aroused. So things to be mindful of. So don't forget, use faire to make, to do with outdoor temperatures. Use avoir to have with human temperatures, and use être to be with the temperature of objects, which is what I just mentioned before. We use être for objects, we use avoir for people, and we use faire to talk about the weather outside. Using il y a, there is or there are. While il fait, it makes, is used with adjectives to describe how things feel, il y a, there is, there are, is usually used with nouns to talk about more visible weather features. Here's the formula. So il y a, partitive article, and the noun. So the partitive articles in French are du, du lait, del, des, that's it. Du, del, de la, and des. Du, del, de la, and des. Du, del, de la, and des. Okay. And this means some or any. So in this instance, if we're talking about visible weather features, for example, if it's snowing outside, or if it's raining outside, you would use this sentence construction to talk about it. You would say il y a, the partitive article, which would be de, du, del, or de la, and then you use the noun to talk about the physical attributes of the weather. Okay. This construction can be a bit tricky for native English speakers because it is adjective would be used for these phrases in English. So take a careful look at the examples below. So if you want to say it's sunny out, in French you would say il y a du soleil. It is sunny.
Il y a du soleil.
Il y a du soleil. Par exemple, aujourd'hui, il y a beaucoup du soleil dehors. Next sentence, il y a du vent. Il y a du vent.
Il y a du vent.
Which means it is windy. Il y a du vent. Then we have il y a du brouillard. Il y a du brouillard.
Il y a du brouillard.
Which means it is foggy. Il y a du brouillard. Then we have il y a des nuages. Il y a des nuages.
Il y a des nuages.
Which means it is cloudy. Il y a des nuages. If you're not sure whether you should use il fait, it makes, or il y a, there is, or there are, for a certain expression, in French, it can help to ask yourself, does what you're describing involve a physical thing? Example, the sun or the wind? If so, French people will probably use il y a, there is or there are, than il fait, it makes. Using le temps est, the weather is. So just to tie up that point before, if you're describing something physical, then something physical about the weather, then French people will use il y a. And il y a means there is or there are. But if you're not talking about something physical and you're talking about like a physical attribute of the weather and you're talking about it being windy, you will say il fait. Okay? I hope that's clear. So the next sentence construction is le temps est, which is the weather is. The construction with il y a, there is or there are, and in noun are the most common and natural way to describe visible weather elements in French. But that doesn't mean that adjectives like cloudy and sunny doesn't exist in French. They do. And you can use them to describe the weather in the following formula. So you would use le temps est and then you would put the adjective. This is the same as saying the weather is adjective in English. Let's go straight into the examples. Le temps est nuageux. The weather is cloudy.
Le temps est nuageux.
Le temps est nuageux. Le temps est nuageux, which means the weather is cloudy. We have le temps est couvert, which means the weather is overcast.
Le temps est couvert.
Le temps est couvert. Le temps est couvert. I think I need to do that over.
Le temps est couvert.
Okay. Le temps est couvert. There's a way I'm saying le temps. Ah, okay. Le tome est couvert. Et voilà. Okay, before I didn't like how it was the word tome was registering in the app. It was registering as TOMB. However, the word is spelled TEMS. So I just wanted to make sure I did it over for it to register. And le temps est couvert means the weather is overcast. We have le temps est orangeux. This is a bit difficult for me to say. Le temps est orangeux.
Le temps est orageux.
Le temps est orageux. Okay. And the reason the T becomes pronounced in et is because orageux starts with a vowel. So le temps est orageux. Le temps est orageux. That didn't register properly.
Le temps est orageux.
Le temps est orageux.
Le temps est orageux.
Ok. Le temps est orageux. Ok, voilà. Le temps est orageux, which means the weather is stormy. Le temps est orageux. Let's listen to my pronunciation. Le temps est orageux.
Le temps est orageux.
I feel like it sounds very close. Le temps est orageux. Le temps est orageux. Then to move on, the next phrase we have le temps est pluvieux. Le temps est pluvieux.
Le temps est pluvieux.
Le temps est pluvieux, which means the weather is rainy. Le temps est pluvieux.
Le temps est pluvieux.
Le temps est pluvieux. Le temps est pluvieux, which means the weather is rainy. Le temps est ensoleillé, which means the weather is sunny.
Le temps est ensoleillé.
Le temps est ensoleillé. Le temps est ensoleillé. And le temps est ensoleillé means the weather is sunny. Par exemple, aujourd'hui, le temps est très ensoleillé. It's very sunny outside, mais it's very cold as well. It's like -5 or -4. It's important to note that you wouldn't normally use these more weather-specific adjectives in the construction il fait, it makes. Again, the construction is more for feeling and expression and mostly involves adjectives that can be used in several different contexts. But you can, of course, use these weather adjectives to describe other nouns such as le ciel, the sky. Le ciel est nuageux, okay?
Le ciel est nuageux.
Le ciel est nuageux, which means the sky is cloudy. Le ciel est nuageux. Then we have le ciel est couvert, which means the sky is overcast.
Le ciel est couvert.
Le ciel est couvert. Then we have le ciel est orageux. Le ciel est orageux. Le ciel est orageux, which means the sky is stormy, which I find to be a bit strange in my view to describe the sky. The sky is stormy. It's not necessarily something I would say in English, but it could be used in French. So the sky is stormy. Le ciel est orageux, because if I would say the weather is stormy and not necessarily the sky. I would say the sky is overcast, definitely. I would say the sky is cloudy. I would say the sky looks menacing. I may not say the sky is stormy, but in French it works. So le ciel est orageux, which means the sky is stormy. Know that you can use le temps est with adjectives of temperature and feeling too, such as froid, which means cool. So for example, le temps est froid. Le temps est froid, which means the weather is cool.
Le temps est froid.
Le temps est froid. However, the il fait, it makes construction, is more commonly used by native French speakers. Okay, using il, it with weather verbs. Sometimes you're not really describing what the weather is like. Instead, you're saying what it is doing. In these situations, in both French and English, you'll need to use a weather-specific verb. Here's the French formula, or the sentence construction in other words. You would say il and the weather verb. The expression made with these weather verbs are, again, always impersonal, since they're not being performed by a specific individual, which is why they are always conjugated with il which means he or it in English. Okay? And with it in English, okay, yeah, which means he or it in English. So let's take a look. So for example, the first one, which means it is raining or it rains.
Il pleut.
Il pleut. Il pleut, which means it is raining or it rains. Then we have il neige.
Il neige.
Which means it is snowing or it snows. Il neige. Then we have il grêle.
Il grêle.
Which means it is hailing or it hails. Il grêle. Then we have il gèle.
Il gèle.
Il gèle, which means it is freezing or it freezes. Il gèle. And voila. As you can see, there aren't many of these weather verbs. However, they're really worth learning as they come up in conversations a lot. So just to run through those phrases again. Il pleut, it's raining.
Il pleut.
Il pleut. Il neige,
Il neige.
which means it is snowing. Il grêle,
Il grêle.
which means it is hailing. And il gèle,
Il gèle.
it's freezing. Regional weather. The phrases that you've learned so far in this lesson are all commonly used in most French-speaking regions. But weather is one of those things where you'll find a lot of variation depending on where you go. You might also hear people describe the weather with phrases like these. Il fait soleil, it is sunny.
Il fait soleil.
Il fait soleil. Il fait du soleil,
Il fait du soleil.
which means it is sunny. Il fait du soleil. Then we have il fait du vent,
Il fait du vent.
which means it is windy. Il fait du vent. Then we have il fait orageux. Il fait orageux.
Il fait orageux.
Il fait orageux. Il fait orageux, which means it is stormy. And we have il fait nuageux.
Il fait nuageux.
Il fait nuageux, which means it is cloudy. So these phrases will sound perfectly correct in some native French speakers, and completely wrong to others. So it's best to learn and stick to the phrases and rules that we've covered earlier in the lesson. So the things that I mentioned before, not these. Just be aware that native speakers in certain areas might use some different phrasings, and it doesn't mean that it's wrong. Just the nuances that exist in a language in different regions is what they're talking about. So weather vocabulary. To wrap things up, here are a few handy weather-related terms that you might need to know. La pluie.
La pluie.
La pluie, which means the rain. La pluie. Let's do that over. La pluie, which means the rain. We have la neige, which means the snow.
La neige.
We have la grêle, which means the hail.
La grêle.
La grêle. Then we have le soleil. Le soleil, which means the sun.
Le soleil.
Then we have le nuage. Le nuage, which means the cloud.
Le nuage.
Le nuage. Then we have le brouillard. Le brouillard. Le brouillard, which means the fog.
Le brouillard.
Le brouillard. Then we have l'orange, which means the thunderstorm.
L'orage.
L'orage, not l'orange, l'orage. L'orage. Again, l'orage means the thunderstorm. Then we have la tempête.
La tempête.
La tempête, which means the storm or the tempest. Then we have la tempête de nuages.
La tempête de neige.
Oh, la tempête de neige. La tempête de neige. La tempête de neige, which means the snowstorm. So, just some key things to remember from this lesson. Key things to remember from this lesson. French uses a number of major sentence structures for talking about the weather. These are, we have il fait, it makes, with an adjective. Then we have il y a, there is, with a noun. Then we have le temps est, the weather is, with an adjective. Then we have il, with a weather verb. Because impersonal expressions are used to talk about the weather, the subject will be il, which means he or it in English. In most weather sentences, the adjectives will be in their masculine singular form. So it's going to take a bit of practice to master this. I definitely know, because this is like the second time I'm going through this lesson, and whilst I'm doing it for the purposes of YouTube, I'm also doing it to be able to memorize this, because there's a lot to take in and to memorize. But with practice, it becomes easier. With practice, you can start having small talk in French around the weather. So, as with every lesson, we end with a culture lesson. So today we're talking about the opening and closing hours in France. Okay. So French opening hours can throw visitors for a bit of a loop. For instance, you might try to visit the post office in the middle of the day and find it closed. Or show up at a restaurant to eat at 6 p.m. and discover that they don't open for another hour. So what gives? Why are French business hours so different from what you might be used to? A big part of the answer is French dining habits. Lunch breaks are a big deal in France. Yes, they are. And workers can be given as much as 2 hours to enjoy their meals and unwind at midday. As a result, many offices, stores, and other non-dining establishments will shut their doors or for a gap from about 12 p.m. to 2 p.m., allowing all of their workers that time away. Restaurants, meanwhile, will open from this midday lunch window, but afterwards, many of them will close again until about 7 p.m. This is because most French people eat supper somewhere between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m., which means that restaurants often see no point in opening earlier. Another part of the answer has to do with French rules. Many stores are obligated to close completely on Sundays in France. However, some businesses, like those selling foodstuff and those in tourist areas, which tend to have longer business hours in general, are exempt from this rule. Opening and closing hours in France can also vary by season, region, and business sector. So at the end of the day, be prepared for closures that might seem unusual to you in France, and remember to check l'heure d'ouverture, the opening hours, or les heures for places before you head out. Okay? So, first phrase.
Les heures d'ouverture.
Les heures d'ouverture. Les heures d'ouverture. C'est pas bon.
Les heures d'ouverture.
Les heures d'ouverture. Les heures d'ouverture. I'll do that one more time. Les heures d'ouverture.
Les heures d'ouverture.
Les heures d'ouverture. Les heures d'ouverture. C'est pas bon. Let me do that one more time. Les heures d'ouverture. Les heures d'ouverture. Okay.
Les horaires.
Les horaires, which is the hours. Les horaires. And voila. And that brings us to the end of this lesson, on talking about the weather. Very straightforward, very clear. Key things to remember. Don't forget the sentence construction for talking about the weather in French. It's il fait. So when we're talking about the weather, il fait plus the adjective is the sentence construction. And il fait is it makes in English. Then if we're talking about the physical attributes of the weather, for example, if you want to say it is raining, we would use il y a which means there is or there are with a noun. If you want to talk about if it's sunny or if it's rainy, we would say le temps est, which means the weather is with an adjective. And if you want to talk about, if you just want to talk about it directly, we say il, which means it with a weather verb. Don't forget also, because impersonal expressions are used to talk about the weather, the subject will always be il, which means he or it in English. And most weather sentences and adjectives will be in their masculine singular form. Thank you so much for joining me today, guys. And I hope you guys have a good week and you have been having a good week so far. See you for the next lesson.